Gregory walked into my office with trembling hands, but it wasn't fear, it was rage. He sat down, fixed his eyes on mine, and said something I never expected to hear. My son died 4 years ago, drowned in a boating accident in Thailand. They found his body, we held the funeral, we buried him. He paused, his jaw clenched. My wife couldn't take it. She hanged herself in his bedroom. I found her body still swinging. I see it every night when I close my eyes. He took a breath. Slow, unsteady. For 4 years I brought flowers to 2 graves. Every Sunday, never missed one. Then he pulled out his phone, showed me a photo, a young man on a beach smiling. This was posted 6 weeks ago. He placed the phone on my desk. My son is alive. As I listened to Gregory, something caught my attention. When he spoke about his son, he used past tense. He loved, he wanted, he dreamed. But once, just once, he slipped into present tense. He didn't notice. I did. That small slip told me something crucial. Gregory's son had already died twice in his mind. Once in Thailand, once when the photo appeared. And now, a third death was waiting. This time Gregory wanted to be the one to deliver it. But there was something else, something Gregory hadn't told me yet. Something about why his son had run. Because sons don't fake their own deaths to escape money, they fake their deaths to escape something much worse, and I had a feeling Gregory knew exactly what that was. In some sessions, my patients heal as they speak. But some stories, they never leave my mind. Today, I'm sharing one of those lives with you. If you're listening to this and things you can't hold inside anymore, share what you're feeling and where you're listening from. I read every comment, I hear every story. If you want to stay updated on the therapy stories, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If this story touched you, you can support me by liking. One day, I'd love to hear your story too. If you want me to share your story in my next video, you can send it to the email in my profile. Remember, our stories heal, even just a little, when they're shared. Gregory reached for a glass of water I'd placed on the table. His hand was steady now. Too steady. The kind of control that comes from decades of boardroom negotiations. I've seen this before. In executives who fire hundreds without flinching. In surgeons who cut into flesh while discussing weekend plans. In people who have trained themselves to bury everything human beneath layers of professional armor. But his eyes betrayed him. They kept darting to that phone on my desk, to his son's face, alive and smiling on a beach halfway around the world. You're wondering why I'm here, he said. Why I'm not already on a plane to Thailand. I remained still. Sometimes the most powerful question is silence. I hired a detective, ex-FBI, cost me $40,000. Gregory's fingers drummed against his thigh, a nervous rhythm he probably wasn't aware of. He found Daniel's address in 3 weeks, a small town called Chiang Rai near the mountains. He swallowed hard. I booked a flight, business class, leaves in 8 days. He studied his hands as if they belonged to someone else. But I don't know what I'll do when I see him. What options are you considering? He met my gaze. For the first time, I saw something other than anger. Exhaustion. The kind that settles into bones after years of carrying an impossible weight. Embrace him, kill him, or just stand there across the street and watch. See if he recognizes the man I've become. His voice fractured on the last word. See if there's anything left of the father he once knew. Gregory presented 3 options: embrace, kill, observe. But the order was significant. The most intimate act came first, violence second, then passive observation. This sequencing revealed his internal hierarchy of desires. Beneath the rage and betrayal, he craved connection more than destruction, but admitting that would mean acknowledging vulnerability. And men like Gregory have spent lifetimes fortifying themselves against such admissions. The anger was easier to carry than the longing. Rage energizes, longing depletes. He had chosen rage because it was the only thing keeping him upright. His phrase, "the man I've become," also struck me. He wasn't asking whether Daniel would recognize him physically. He was asking something deeper. Had grief hollowed him out so completely that nothing remained of who he used to be? "Tell me about Daniel," I said. "Not the son who disappeared, the son you raised." Gregory's posture shifted. His shoulders drew inward, chin dropping slightly. His fingers gripped the armrest until his knuckles blanched white. I watched his breathing accelerate, shallow, rapid. He was perfect, everyone said so. Teachers, coaches, neighbors. Top of his class from kindergarten through graduate school. Full scholarship to Columbia, spoke 3 languages fluently, could walk into any room and own it within 5 minutes. That's his resume. I asked about your son. The air in the room thickened. Gregory turned toward the window. Rain streaked down the glass, distorting the city into something unrecognizable. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Lower. Rougher. I don't know who my son was. The confession hung between us like smoke. I knew what he achieved. I knew what he looked like at graduations, at holiday dinners, in the photos we sent to relatives. But who he was when no one was watching, what kept him awake at night, what made him feel alive. He shook his head slowly. I have absolutely no idea. That admission cracked something open. Gregory had confessed to a particular kind of blindness, the kind that doesn't happen by accident. Parents who don't know their children usually don't want to know. They've constructed something, a narrative, an image, a family portrait suitable for display, and examining it too closely might reveal fractures they're not prepared to face. I was beginning to understand why Daniel had vanished. But the picture remained incomplete. There was a mother in this story, a wife who hanged herself in her son's bedroom, and Gregory hadn't mentioned her role in Daniel's life at all. That omission told me everything. The people we avoid discussing are usually the ones who matter most. Tell me about your wife, I said. Tell me about Margaret. Gregory's hands curled into fists, his breathing grew shallow and quick. The body always speaks before the mouth is ready. Margaret was... Gregory started again. His throat worked as he swallowed. Margaret came from nothing. Grew up in a trailer park in West Virginia, daughter of a coal miner and a grocery store cashier. Put herself through nursing school working double shifts. When I met her, she was 23 and had already saved more money than anyone in her family had ever seen. His eyes grew distant, traveling backward through time. She understood what it meant to build something from nothing. That's why she supported my work, all those years of travel, all those missed dinners. She believed in the empire we were constructing. She thought it would give Daniel everything she never had. He leaned forward, voice dropping. Margaret became the architect of our family. She planned every meal, remembered every birthday preference, knew every teacher's name and every friend's family situation. She kept a color-coded calendar on the refrigerator, blue for Daniel's activities, green for my travel, red for family events, yellow for her own appointments, though those were always fewest. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, then vanished. Everything had its place. Everyone had their role. And what was your role? I built the company, made the money, provided. The word landed like a verdict. That was our agreement when we married. She would raise him. I would give them everything money could buy. How often were you home during Daniel's childhood? His fingers dug into his thigh, leaving marks through expensive fabric. I traveled constantly, Asia mostly. Shanghai, Singapore, Tokyo, Bangkok, sometimes all 4 in a single week. Building distribution networks. Securing partnerships. He exhaled sharply. Some years I logged over 200 days on the road. How old was Daniel during those years? 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Each number fell like a hammer blow. The formative years, I know that now. I've read everything, attachment theory, developmental psychology, the research on father absence, all of it. His voice turned acidic. 20 years too late. Gregory had identified his absence during Daniel's critical developmental window. Between ages 8 and 12, children construct their fundamental understanding of attachment, trust, and self-worth through relationships with primary caregivers, especially the same-sex parent. For boys, fathers serve as the primary model for masculine identity and emotional regulation. A physically absent father often translates in the child's unconscious to rejection. The child formulates a question they may never speak aloud. Why isn't he here? What's wrong with me that makes him choose everywhere else over home? Without explicit intervention, this question calcifies into belief. I am not worth staying for. This belief then shapes every subsequent relationship, every measure of self-worth, every expectation of how love should feel. Daniel had spent his formative years learning that love meant absence, that success required disappearing, that the people who claimed to care about you would always choose something else. When you were home, I asked, what did time with Daniel look like? Gregory's gaze drifted upward, searching. Report cards. We'd review his grades in my study, me behind the desk, him across from me. Like a quarterly performance review. He seemed to hear himself and winced. I'd ask about his goals, his 5-year plan. By 12, I had him reading business books, Good to Great, The 7 Habits. I wanted him prepared. Prepared for what? To take over. The company. Everything I built was for him. His voice strained against something internal. Every missed birthday, every empty chair at dinner, every phone call cut short, it was all for him, to give him an empire. He laughed bitterly. That's what I told myself. That sacrifice and love were the same thing. Did Daniel want the company? Silence stretched taut between us. I never asked. 3 words. I never asked. In 22 years of practice, I've learned that families rarely shatter from what's spoken, they shatter from what remains unsaid. The questions never posed, the feelings never acknowledged, the assumptions that harden into walls. Daniel had been sculpted into something, a legacy, an heir, a return on investment. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped existing as a person in his father's eyes. He'd become a project with a projected completion date. And Gregory had been so focused on the blueprint that he'd never noticed his son was suffocating beneath it. What did Daniel actually love? I asked. Not what he excelled at. What brought him alive? Gregory opened his mouth, closed it, his brow furrowed like a man reaching for a word in an unfamiliar language. Margaret would know. She always knew those things. He stopped cold. The realization struck him physically, his whole body deflated. Margaret was dead, and with her had died any bridge to understanding his son. But I needed to understand Margaret better. Not just as a wife who died, but as the woman who had spent 2 decades holding this family together. Tell me more about Margaret's relationship with Daniel. What did she see that you didn't? Gregory's expression shifted. Something raw moved behind his eyes. She saw everything. That was her gift and her curse. He rubbed his face with both hands. She used to tell me things, small things about Daniel, that he'd been quiet at dinner, that he'd stopped mentioning certain friends, that she'd found poems hidden in his desk drawer. His hands dropped. I'd nod and change the subject. I thought she was being overprotective, seeing problems where there weren't any. What kind of poems? I don't know. I never read them. The admission seemed to cost him something. Margaret wanted me to. She said they were beautiful but sad. She said Daniel had a whole world inside him that no one knew about. He met my eyes, and I saw something shatter quietly behind his gaze. I told her he'd grow out of it, that poetry didn't build companies. Poetry didn't build companies. In that single dismissal, Gregory had revealed the lens through which he'd viewed his entire family. Everything measured by utility. Every person assessed by productivity. Margaret had tried to show him Daniel's inner world, had handed him the key, and Gregory had tossed it aside because it couldn't be monetized. I was beginning to understand Margaret's exhaustion. For 20 years, she'd served as translator between a father who spoke only in metrics and a son who communicated in metaphors. She'd tried to bridge 2 languages, 2 worlds, 2 people who should have been close enough to touch, but couldn't find each other across the distance. There was a fight, Gregory said abruptly. His voice sounded different, scraped raw like a wound freshly reopened. A month before Daniel left for Thailand, the last real conversation we ever had. I leaned forward slightly. This was the fault line I'd been searching for. Daniel had just finished his MBA, top of his class naturally. I'd prepared his corner office for months, brass nameplate already on the door. Daniel Whitmore, Executive Vice President. I'd commissioned it myself. Gregory's voice curdled with old bitterness. He came to dinner that night, sat across from Margaret and me, and told us he wasn't taking the position. What did he want instead? He wanted to write, travel, find himself. Gregory spat the words like spoiled food. 24 years old with an MBA from Columbia, and he wanted to wander the globe with a notebook like some trust fund bohemian. What did you say to him? Gregory's jaw muscles clenched visibly. The tendons in his neck stood out like cables. I told him he was throwing away everything I'd built, every sacrifice, every missed moment, every year of my life, wasted. I called him selfish, ungrateful, delusional. His voice dropped to a whisper. I told him he was a disappointment, that I didn't recognize him, that the son I raised would never abandon responsibility for fairy tales. How did Daniel respond? He looked at me. This expression I'd never seen before, like he was finally seeing me clearly after years of fog, and he said, Gregory's voice cracked. A tear escaped down his weathered cheek. He didn't wipe it away. You're right. You never did raise me. Mom did. You just funded it. Daniel's words functioned as a mirror, reflecting back what Gregory had spent decades avoiding, the transactional architecture of his fatherhood. Money exchanged for presents. Achievements tallied instead of emotions acknowledged. A brass nameplate offered as proof of love. In that single sentence, Daniel had named the hollowness at the center of their relationship, and the truth was so surgically precise that Gregory couldn't deflect it. He could only absorb the wound. I noted something else. Daniel had said, Mom did, not Mom does. Even before his staged death, he'd already been speaking of his mother, in past tense. Some part of him had known she was already lost. What happened after that? He stood up and walked out. That Margaret ran after him. I heard her crying in the driveway, begging him to come back inside. I stayed at the table. Gregory's laugh was hollow. Poured myself another glass of wine, finished my steak, sat there alone while my family disintegrated on the front lawn. Did you attempt contact after that night? No. I decided he needed to learn consequences. That he'd come crawling back when the money ran out. Gregory shook his head at his own arrogance. I treated my son's dreams like a hostile takeover, figured I could wait him out. He went silent for a moment, gathering himself. 3 weeks later, he left for Thailand. 6 weeks after that, Thai police called. Boating accident, body recovered, passport and wallet found, DNA matched. And you never questioned it. Why would I? The evidence was there. My son was dead. His voice hardened to granite. That's what killed Margaret. Margaret blamed herself. Gregory continued. Each word emerged slower than the last, heavy as wet concrete. The night Daniel walked out, she begged me to call him, stood in my study with mascara running down her face, pleading, just apologize, just tell him you love him, just give him something to hold on to. Did you? No. The word dropped like a stone down a well. I said he needed discipline, that cuddling him had created this mess, that if she hadn't indulged his artistic nonsense, he'd be focused on real work. His voice fractured. I blamed her for raising him wrong the night our son left forever. I blamed her. I let the silence expand. Sometimes a therapist's greatest tool is empty space. After the funeral, Margaret stopped functioning, stopped sleeping, stopped eating. She'd drift into Daniel's room at midnight. We hadn't touched anything, hadn't moved a single book, and sit on his bed for hours. I'd hear her talking to him through the walls, asking for forgiveness. Forgiveness for what? Gregory's eyes met mine. They held decades of accumulated grief, for not protecting him, from me. 6 words, and they contained an entire family's tragedy. Margaret hadn't simply lost a son, she'd watched her husband drive him away while she stood helpless at the intersection. For 20 years, she'd positioned herself as the buffer between Gregory's expectations and Daniel's authentic self. She'd translated her husband's cold metrics into something resembling warmth. She'd tried to fill the emotional void that Gregory's absence had created. And when Daniel finally fled, she'd internalized the failure completely. In her mind, she hadn't protected her child from the person who should have loved him most. The guilt must have been crushing, and Gregory, lost in his own grievances, had added to her burden instead of sharing it. 3 months after Daniel's funeral, Gregory said, I came home from Hong Kong. Red-eye flight arrived around dawn. The house was silent in a way that felt wrong. His hands gripped his knees so hard his knuckles went bone white. I called her name. Nothing. Climbed the stairs. The door to Daniel's room was open. His breathing became irregular, ragged. She was hanging from the ceiling fan. She'd used the belt from Daniel's old robe, this blue terry cloth thing he'd gotten for Christmas when he was 16. Her feet were 6 inches off the floor. Her face was... He couldn't finish. I waited. She left a note, 1 sentence. I can't live in a house where I failed both of them. Margaret's suicide note revealed the depth of her psychological burden. She'd cast herself as the failed mediator, the person responsible for bridging an unbridgeable gap between father and son. In family systems theory, we call this the emotional manager role. This person assumes responsibility for everyone's feelings, everyone's relationships, everyone's well-being. They become the family's nervous system, processing every conflict, absorbing every tension. When the system collapses, they believe themselves to be the point of failure, even when the fractures originated elsewhere and long before. Margaret had been carrying 2 dysfunctional relationships for over 2 decades, Gregory's emotional absence and Daniel's resulting pain. She tried to compensate for what Gregory couldn't give. She tried to interpret her husband to her son and her son to her husband. When Daniel died, that burden became unsurvivable. She collapsed under the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent holding together people who didn't know how to hold themselves. "Gregory," I said gently, "did Margaret ever share what she and Daniel discussed? What she understood about him that you didn't?" He nodded slowly. His eyes had gone distant, focused on something beyond the room. "After she died, I found journals, hers and Daniel's both. He'd left his behind when he moved to his own apartment after college. She'd kept them all these years, hidden in her closet inside a shoebox behind winter coats." "Did you read them?" "I couldn't, not then. I sealed them in a box, put them in storage with everything else." He met my eyes again. "I read them 2 weeks ago, after I discovered Daniel was alive." "What did you find?" Gregory's entire body tremored. His carefully constructed composure was finally crumbling. "Everything I should have seen, everything I chose not to see." "Daniel started writing at 11, Gregory said. "The year I opened our Asian headquarters, the year I spent 8 months overseas. Margaret bought him a leather journal for his birthday. I wasn't there for that either." He withdrew a worn notebook from his bag. I hadn't noticed it before. The leather was cracked, pages yellowed, which he held it like it might dissolve, or detonate. He wrote about waiting, page after page about waiting, waiting for me to come home, waiting for me to notice him, waiting for me to ask a question that wasn't about grades or goals or performance metrics. Gregory's voice splintered. He wrote about how, when I was home, I only asked about achievements, about what he was becoming, never about who he already was. What else? There's an entry from when he was 14. He'd won a regional writing competition. A short story about a boy who invents a machine to bring his absent father home from work. Margaret framed the certificate, called me in Singapore to share the news. Gregory's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I told her I was proud. Then I asked about his math grades. I didn't ask what the story was about, didn't ask to read it, didn't ask why my 14-year-old son was writing about a machine to bring me home. He opened the journal to a marked page. His hands trembled as he read. "Dad called today. I won the writing contest. I wanted him to read it. He asked about math. He always asks about math. I think if I won the Nobel Prize for Literature, he'd ask why I didn't win it for economics instead." Gregory's voice broke completely. "Maybe I don't exist to him. Maybe I'm just a report card with legs. A machine to bring his father home." At 14, Daniel had poured his loneliness into a story about desperate invention, and Gregory had responded by asking about mathematics. In that single exchange, a message was transmitted with devastating clarity. Your inner world doesn't matter. Your creativity is irrelevant. Your emotional needs are secondary to measurable outcomes. Everything that made Daniel himself, his imagination, his sensitivity, his artistic soul, had been dismissed with a 3-word question. And he was only 14, still forming, still hopeful, still believing that someday, if he achieved enough, his father might finally see him. The tragedy wasn't that Gregory didn't love his son. The tragedy was that his love was invisible, hidden behind metrics and expectations, a language Daniel couldn't hear. "Gregory," I said, "when children repeatedly encounter indifference to their emotional expressions, they develop what we call a false self. They construct a version of themselves designed to earn approval. The achiever, the success story, the perfect son. Meanwhile, the true self retreats deeper and deeper into hiding. It doesn't disappear. It waits, it watches, and eventually it decides whether to stay or leave." Gregory's eyes glistened. Tears gathered but didn't fall. "There was another entry," he said, "from the week before Thailand, after our fight." "What did it say?" He turned to a different page. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold the journal steady. Without speaking, he handed it to me. I looked down at the page. The handwriting was small, precise, controlled, except for the final line, which had been pressed so hard the pen had nearly torn through the paper. I've been dead to him my whole life. Now I'll make it official. Daniel's final entry wasn't a suicide note, it was a declaration of emancipation. He hadn't planned to end his life. He'd planned to end his existence in his father's world. The faked death wasn't primarily about money, though the inheritance enabled his escape. It was about achieving the visibility that invisibility couldn't provide. The cruelest irony, Daniel made himself literally disappear to a father who had never noticed him present. He chose actual death over metaphorical death. He chose to be mourned rather than overlooked, and in that terrible choice, he finally claimed what he'd never been granted, the power to define his own existence. Gregory, I said, I need to ask you something. When you received news of Daniel's death, what was your very first feeling? Before grief, before shock? What arose first? He sat motionless for a long moment. Rain continued its assault on the windows. Failure, he finally admitted. I felt like a project had collapsed, like an investment had defaulted, like decades of work had yielded nothing. His voice shattered entirely. My first thought about my son's death was about wasted resources. What kind of father thinks that way? Gregory, I need you to understand something, I said. You didn't fail because Daniel rejected your path. You failed because you never offered an alternative. You constructed a cage and labeled it opportunity. You built a prison and called it legacy. And when Daniel finally escaped, you named it betrayal. He flinched as though struck. Daniel didn't fake his death because he hated you. He did it because he couldn't imagine being alive and being seen by you simultaneously. The inheritance wasn't the objective, it was the vehicle. He used it to construct a life where he could finally become the person he'd concealed for 2 decades. But Margaret, Gregory's voice cracked, she died because of what he did. He killed her, just as surely as if he'd tied that belt himself. Did he? Or did she die because she'd spent 20 years trying to bridge an unbridgeable distance? Trying to make you see what you refused to see? Trying to protect a son from a father who measured love in metrics? Gregory's expression contorted. Anguish and rage battled across his features. Margaret wasn't destroyed by Daniel's choice, I continued. She was exhausted by decades of holding together a family that had never truly been whole. Her suicide wasn't about his death. It was about a lifetime of failed translation. She died in the space between you, in the gap she'd spent 20 years trying to close. Silence filled the room. Gregory's breathing came shallow and fast. I watched him wrestling with a narrative he'd carried for 4 years. The story where Daniel was villain and Margaret was innocent victim. That story had been safer. It had assigned clear roles. Grieving father, cruel son, tragic mother. It had absolved Gregory of examination. But the truth was more complicated and more damaging. Daniel had made a terrible choice. But he'd made it because he couldn't find another door. Margaret had died, but she'd been dying slowly for years, crushed between 2 people she loved who couldn't find their way to each other, and Gregory had been so busy building an empire that he'd failed to notice his family crumbling inside it. Gregory, I said, what do you actually want from Daniel now? Not what anger demands, not what grief insists. What do you genuinely want? He looked at me. For the first time, the rage had emptied from his expression. What remained was something rawer, younger, the face of a man stripped to his most essential self. I want him to tell me who he is, he whispered. I want to meet my son, for the first time. This was the breakthrough. Gregory had shifted from vengeance to connection. The desire to meet Daniel acknowledged what he'd spent decades avoiding, he had never truly known his son. He was admitting to 24 years of blindness. This is the first step toward genuine repair. Acknowledging the absence that existed even during presence, recognizing that you can share a home, share blood, share a name, and still remain strangers. Gregory couldn't undo the past. He couldn't resurrect Margaret. He couldn't return Daniel's stolen childhood. But he could, perhaps, begin to see clearly. And clear sight is where all healing begins. Tell me what the detective discovered, I said. What is Daniel's life like now? Gregory withdrew a manila folder from his bag. His movements had slowed, the early attention draining away. He lives in northern Thailand, a small mountain town called Chiang Rai. He runs a hostel, nothing fancy, 8 rooms. A small cafe that serves breakfast to backpackers. Gregory's voice softened unexpectedly. There's a garden behind the building where he grows his own vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, Thai basil. What else? He teaches English to local children. Twice a week, a Buddhist temple, no charge. Gregory swallowed. He writes, published 2 novels under a pen name, Marcus Hale. The detective found them. I ordered both. Read them in 2 days. What are they about? Gregory was quiet for a long moment. The first one is about a man who spends his entire life building a castle, stone by stone, year by year, convinced he's creating a legacy, but everyone leaves, his wife, his children, his friends. They find the castle beautiful but cold, impossible to live in. In the final chapter, you realize the man has been building his own tomb. He dies surrounded by wealth, completely alone. He paused, took a breath that shuddered through him. The second novel is about a mother drowning. She's trying to save 2 people swimming in opposite directions. No matter how hard she struggles, the current keeps pulling them apart. She can't reach either one. The last line is, she died in the space between them, reaching for hands that were never reaching back. Daniel had been processing his family through fiction for years. The castle builder was unmistakably Gregory, a man who'd confused construction with connection, who'd built walls instead of bridges. The drowning mother was Margaret, exhausted by the impossible task of holding together people who couldn't hold each other. And in writing these stories, Daniel had been doing what his father never allowed, expressing his truth, speaking his pain in the only language that felt safe. I wondered if Gregory understood that these novels were letters Daniel couldn't send, eulogies for a family that had died long before anyone stopped breathing. He knows you're coming, Gregory said suddenly. What do you mean? The detective made contact, posed as a journalist interested in the novels. Daniel was friendly initially. I answered questions about his writing process, his influences. Then he went quiet for a week. Gregory reached into his pocket, withdrew a folded paper. He sent a message through the detective. He'd figured out the truth. What did he say? He said he'd meet me, but only if I came alone. No lawyers. No accusations, just a conversation between father and son to fun. Gregory unfolded the paper, read aloud. If he wants to finally meet me, I'll be here. I've been waiting my whole life. What did you decide? I'm going. Gregory's voice had found new ground, steadier, resolved. Not to confront, not to punish, not to demand explanations. He met my eyes with something approaching clarity. I'm going to listen. For the first time in his life, I'm going to sit across from my son and actually listen. Gregory had arrived in my office prepared to kill or embrace the extremes of unresolved grief. He was leaving with something far more difficult, the intention to simply be present, to listen without defending, to witness without judging. This is remarkably difficult for people who've spent lifetimes in control. Listening requires surrender. It demands accepting that you don't already possess the answers. It means sitting with discomfort, with uncertainty, with the terrifying possibility that everything you believed about yourself might be wrong. Gregory was preparing to do the hardest thing a parent can do, acknowledge their failures to the child they failed. We met 3 more times before Gregory's flight. Each session focused on what he would say and more critically what he wouldn't. Your first instinct will be self-defense, I warned him. When Daniel describes how your absence affected him, every fiber of your being will want to explain, to justify, to contextualize. Resist that. In that moment, explanations aren't healing. They're deflection. They communicate. My reasons matter more than your pain. Gregory nodded. He was taking notes, something he'd never done in our sessions before. You'll also feel compelled to mention Margaret, to ensure Daniel understands what his disappearance caused. But her death isn't a weapon for you to wield. Her suicide resulted from many factors: your emotional absence, Daniel's pain, her own lifelong depression. Depression? Gregory looked startled. Margaret wasn't depressed. Her journals tell a different story. She'd been struggling since before Daniel was born. She never told you because she didn't want to add to your burdens. She didn't want to seem weak. I let that settle. She was carrying far more than you ever knew. Gregory's eyes closed. Another layer of grief settling onto shoulders already bowed. If Daniel asks about his mother, tell him the truth, but don't weaponize her death to inflict guilt. He's already drowning in guilt. Adding more won't bring reconciliation. What if he doesn't care? Gregory's voice shrank. What if 4 years have made him into someone who doesn't need me at all? What if I fly halfway around the world, and he feels nothing? Then you'll grieve that too, but at least you'll know. The uncertainty will end and you'll have tried. We sat with the weight of that possibility. I keep hearing that journal entry, Gregory said finally. I've been dead to him my whole life. It plays constantly when I'm trying to sleep, when I'm driving, when I'm standing in the shower, those words. Good. Let them stay with you, not as punishment, as compass. Let them remind you why you're making this journey. You're not going to reclaim a son. You're not going to repair what's broken. You're going to discover someone you never took time to know. Gregory departed for Thailand on a Tuesday morning. I stood at my office window watching rain streak the glass, wondering what he would find on the other side of the world. Whether Daniel would even open the door. Whether 4 years of distance had calcified into permanent separation. I didn't hear from Gregory for 3 weeks. No calls, no emails. The silence stretched and I found myself checking my phone more often than professional distance should allow. When the message finally arrived, it was brief, but it told me everything. Dr. Bennett, I found him. He was standing outside his hostel when my taxi arrived. The detective had sent photographs, but nothing prepares you for seeing your child alive after 4 years of believing them dead. He looked older, thinner, sun-darkened, but the same eyes. Margaret's eyes, those dark brown eyes that always seemed to be waiting for something that never came. He didn't run. He didn't rage. He just stood there watching me exit the taxi, as though he'd been waiting exactly this way for 4 years, as though he'd been waiting his entire life. We sat in his cafe. He made tea, properly the Thai way, something he said took years to learn. We faced each other across a wooden table he'd built with his own hands, and we talked for 6 hours. I did what you instructed. I listened. I didn't defend. I didn't explain. I didn't make it about myself. I just listened. He told me about feeling invisible for 24 years, about standing at the window watching my taxi leave for the airport, wondering when I'd return and whether I'd actually see him when I did, about the pressure of being a legacy rather than a son, about the night he decided to vanish, sitting in a Bangkok hotel room with a ferry ticket and forged passport, knowing he was about to shatter everything but feeling like everything was already shattered. He asked about Margaret. I told him everything. How she blamed herself, how she stopped sleeping, how she wandered into his room every night to talk to the ghost of him, how I found her. I didn't spare myself. I confessed how I'd refused to call him, how pride had poisoned me, how I'd treated my own child like a hostile negotiation. He wept. I wept with him. We sat on the floor of his cafe at 2 a.m, 2 grown men sobbing for a woman we'd both failed to save. In different ways. For different reasons. But the failure was shared. He said something I'll carry forever. He said I didn't want to hurt her. I thought she'd be relieved. I thought without me there to remind her of everything you weren't, she could finally be happy. He believed his existence caused her pain. He removed himself thinking he was freeing her. He didn't understand that she loved him so completely that losing him was unsurvivable. I don't know if he'll ever return to America. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. I'm not even sure forgiveness is the right framework for what we need. But I know this. I finally met my son. For the first time in 28 years, I sat across from him and actually saw him, not his grades, not his potential, not my projections. Him. I'm staying another week. He's gonna show me his garden. He's gonna let me read his 3rd novel, still in progress. It's about a man who wakes inside a coffin, realizes he was buried alive, and spends the entire book trying to dig his way out. Daniel says he doesn't know yet how it ends. I think we're both still digging. Thank you for teaching me how to see. Gregory. I read that message 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and sat in the silence of my office as evening light faded across the walls. I thought about the families I've worked with over 2 decades, the ones who never reached reconciliation, the ones who died before speaking crucial words, the ones who chose pride over connection and lived with permanent regret. Gregory and Daniel weren't healed. Their story wasn't finished. Margaret remained dead, and her absence would shadow them forever. But they had something most shattered families never receive: a second chance, an opportunity to build something new from the wreckage of what came before. I've thought about Gregory and Daniel many times since that message arrived. About 4 years of grief constructed on a lie, about a mother who died for a son who was still breathing halfway across the world, about a father who had to lose everything: son, wife, certainty, before he could see what had been directly in front of him all along. People sometimes ask whether Daniel was wrong for what he did, for faking his death, for letting his mother die, believing he was gone, for stealing the inheritance and vanishing. The answer isn't simple. What Daniel did caused immeasurable harm. Margaret died believing her only child had drowned. Gregory spent 4 years bringing flowers to an empty grave. But Daniel was also a young man who'd spent his entire existence being invisible to the person who should have seen him most clearly. He'd been reduced to achievements, measured in grades and degrees and professional milestones. He tried to tell his father who he actually was and been met with disappointment and rejection. Sometimes the only way to become visible is to disappear completely. Sometimes the only way to be heard is to become permanently silent. Daniel chose a dramatic, painful escape, but he chose it because he couldn't locate any other exit. Gregory and Daniel have a long road ahead. Forgiveness isn't a moment. It's a practice, a daily choice. Some days will feel possible. Others will reopen old wounds. Margaret's absence will always occupy the space between them. The guilt will never fully dissolve. But they're walking that road together now. And that's more than most families who've experienced this kind of rupture ever achieve. Gregory came to my office prepared to kill or embrace his son. He left Thailand having done neither. Instead, he did something far more difficult. He sat with uncertainty. He allowed his son to be a stranger. And then, slowly, patiently, he began learning who that stranger actually was. That's where healing originates, not in resolution, not in answers, not in tidy conclusions, where everyone forgives and moves forward. Healing begins with willingness to remain in the room with someone, even when you don't understand them, even when their choices have wounded you, even when you've spent a lifetime failing to see them, even when seeing them requires finally seeing yourself. Gregory returned home after 3 weeks in Thailand. He visits Daniel twice a year now. They speak by phone every Sunday, the same day Gregory once brought flowers to the cemetery. Daniel hasn't returned to America, perhaps he never will. But they're constructing something new. Not a repair of the old relationship. There wasn't enough relationship to repair. Something entirely new. Something that began the day Gregory walked into that cafe and finally sat down to listen. Last month, Daniel sent me a copy of his finished novel, the one about the man buried alive. In the end, the man doesn't escape alone. Someone hears his knocking from above. Someone begins digging from the other side. They meet in the middle, in the darkness, in the space between death and life. Daniel inscribed the book for Dr. Bennett. Thank you for teaching my father how to dig. I hope this story has helped you look at your own life, your emotions, or the people around you through different eyes. I hope it has helped you understand yourself and others more deeply. I would love to hear something about you in the comments, to know you and your story a little better. If you want to share what's inside you, you can write to the email address in my profile. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe. To be notified when the next real-life story is released, click the bell icon to turn on notifications. Before we end, I want to ask you a few questions. Take a moment to consider them. What do you think about this story? Does Gregory's journey remind you of anything in your own life or in the lives of people you know? If you were Daniel, could you have forgiven your father after everything? Or are some wounds too deep to ever fully heal? Do you think Daniel was wrong to fake his death? Was it an act of cruelty or the desperate act of someone who couldn't find any other escape? What would you say to Gregory if you could sit across from him in my office? What would you say to Daniel? Have you ever felt invisible to someone who should have seen you clearly? How did you cope with that pain? Did you ever find a way to become visible? And finally, is it ever too late to truly know another person? Can love, real, authentic love, begin even after years of distance and damage? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Your perspective matters. Your voice matters. Your story matters.